Hello and welcome to this virtual JNUC 2020 session on managing FileVault in macOS Catalina. My name is Frederick. I'm one of the enterprise support engineers for Jamf in Amsterdam. Some people may also know me from the Traveling Tech Guy blog or the ebook I wrote on the matter earlier this year. For this session, we're going to go through the following agenda. First of all, some terminology, secure token flows, remotely enforcing FileVault, recovery keys, and some troubleshooting and fixes. So let's start with some basic terminology. I think we're all quite familiar with FileVault in general, but as a quick overview, FileVault was introduced by Apple in macOS Panther, and initially it was only to encrypt the user's home folder. Later on, in macOS Lion, FileVault 2 was launched or was released by Apple, and this brought the ability to encrypt the full startup disk. But the most important changes were, first of all, the introduction of secure token in macOS High Sierra and the Bootstrap token later and quite recently on macOS Catalina. We're going to have a look at those topics closer later in the session. But first of all, what is a secure token? Well, I'm not an encryption expert, so let's keep things simple and summarize it as a wrapped version of an encryption key, which is protected by a user's password. And we could say that this is basically an attribute linked to a user's account to allow that user to interact with FileVault. In the past, we could just flag a user to be FileVault enabled, but in more recent macOS versions, as from High Sierra, that user needs to be given a secure token first before we can make that user FileVault enabled and allow it to interact with FileVault. The Bootstrap token introduced in macOS Catalina was added by Apple in order to facilitate the management of FileVault and the management of FileVault-enabled users. So in say, the management of secure token users. And there was a need for this functionality by a lot of Mac admins who actually need an additional administrator on their managed systems, which has a secure token, in order to be able to have an administrator account to interact with FileVault when needed. And this to avoid that you need to use the recovery key every time a user password is forgotten, for instance. So the Bootstrap token is basically a special token which is generated by MDM enrollment and which adds the ability to automatically generate a secure token for what Apple calls the managed administrator or mobile accounts if we bind our Macs to Active Directory. Important to remember is that automatically generates does not mean that without any action, the administrator or the mobile account receives that secure token, but we actually need a login through the login window on the macOS to actually generate that secure token. But later about this in this session. The managed administrator, what is that? So if we look at the MDM specifications from Apple, it states that whenever we use automated enrollment, or previously called DEP, and we downgrade the end user which is created, or the account which is created during this pre-stage to standard privileges, or we skip the account creation entirely, Apple MDM specification requires that the MDM server creates an additional admin on the system. And that is what we call the managed administrator, which is instead not the same as the Jamf management account. The managed administrator is created by MDM prior to the setup assistant. And if you have a look at Jamf Pro, this would basically be the account which we specify in the pre-stage settings for our enrollment. It is the option to create a local administrator before the setup assistant. You can hide that account if you want, but it needs to be created if we limit the user creation to standard or we skip account creation. As I said, it is in say not the same as the Jamf management account, which is created by the Jamf binary. And the management account is more a legacy thing from previous Jamf Pro versions, and is the account which we specify in the user-initiated enrollment settings. And those settings are also needed in order to do a pre-stage or a DEP enrollment. But the account that we specify here may or may not be the same as the managed administrator which we create in the pre-stage. In most cases, I choose to specify it as the same account because of a few reasons. First of all, I tend to limit the number of administrator accounts that are created on the system. Too much administrator accounts doesn't sound like a good idea. But also it helps me with the management of secure token and also the rotation of personal recovery keys, which we're going to see later. However, you can still choose to create a separate account as the management account, or define a separate account, which will then be created later during the enrollment process by the Jamf binary. If you keep it the same, the only downside is that you lose the possibility to randomize the management account's password. But that's a consequence you have to deal with if you want to keep the account the same. One little thing here on the management account is that the account actually does not need to exist on the Mac for the Jamf binary to work. The only thing that Jamf Pro needs is that it has a reference to the credentials, username, and password in the inventory of each Mac to consider the Mac as managed. Like I said, it's a legacy thing from previous Jamf Pro versions, but it can actually be any account which does not really need to exist. The only way or the only reason why Jamf may use that account is if you use Jamf Remote, the additional tool next to the Jamf Pro GUI to remote into your machines, or like we're going to see later, the rotation of a personal recovery key by using a Jamf Pro also uses the management account in some situations. Deferred enablement. A lot of people see deferred enablement as a bad thing or something which is wrong. But it is basically nothing more than expected behavior when you are remotely enabling or enforcing FileVault. This with a Jamf Pro policy or an MDM configuration profile. The reason for that is, whenever you enable FileVault, you need to authenticate, especially since the introduction of secure token. And this means that if you just install a profile via MDM, there is no possibility to actually ask the user to authenticate and provide the password. You could potentially think of a scenario where that would be possible with a policy in Jamf Pro, but what macOS basically does when FileVault is enforced remotely, policy or profile, is that macOS will delay the actual enablement and the activation of FileVault on the system until the next opportunity where the user can provide the password, which is either a logout or a login. So when the policy enforcing FileVault just executed or a profile just installed, macOS just delays or defers that enablement until the next logout or the next login. Next, we have recovery keys. Yes, you can use iCloud as a recovery backdoor into FileVault or into the system if you forget your password by linking your Apple ID to the local account on the Mac, which is, in my opinion, not the best management solution here. So let's have a look at the recovery keys. We have the choice between a personal or an institutional recovery key. Personal recovery key is a random or pseudo-random code, 120-bit, which is automatically generated when FileVault is enabled. You can see the syntax there. It's 6 groups of 4 characters. If we look at institutional recovery keys, an institutional recovery key is basically a keychain which contains a public cert in the form, or the public key in the form of a certificate and a private key. You encrypt the drive with the public key and you decrypt the drive whenever needed with the keychain, including the private key. So that was a little bit of terminology. Let's have a look at secure token flows. For those who are familiar with the blog, you know that I'm quite a fan of flowcharts. This is the latest flowchart I made, which is valid since macOS Catalina 10.15.4. And I'm going to try to break that down in smaller pieces to make it a little bit clear. Let's first have a look at user-initiated enrollment. If we do user-initiated enrollment, there is actually no MDM involved during the initial setup of the Mac. This means that you would go through the setup assistant. The setup assistant would automatically create an admin user for you, and that admin account automatically gets a secure token. Later, you would enroll your device into MDM, and the act of enrolling your computer or your Mac manually in MDM has no impact or influence on secure token at all. Even if the Jamf Pro binary is installing or creating a management account, that management account does not get a secure token. Things are a bit different, of course, with automated MDM enrollment, because here we can choose if we create an account in the setup assistant or not. If we choose to create an account during the setup assistant, on macOS Catalina, it does not matter if that account is created as a standard or an administrator account. In both situations, the account created by the end user through the setup assistant will get a secure token. If, however, we skip account creation during the setup assistant, then we end up at a macOS login window with no secure token. Yes, we might have or we will have the managed administrator, which is created by MDM in the background, but even that account does not get a secure token. So if we skip account creation, no secure token when we reach the login window. But then it depends which account is actually going to log into the system to see what is going to happen with our secure tokens next. If we do an Active Directory bind, we would then log in with a mobile account, and the act of logging in with a mobile account without Bootstrap, I'm going to come back to Bootstrap later, but we skipped account creation, no secure token, no Bootstrap, we bind the Mac to AD and log in with a mobile account. That account does not get a secure token. The good news, however, is that a mobile account without a secure token, admin or standard, can still enable FileVault. And when FileVault gets enabled, the account who enabled FileVault gets a secure token. So that's the good news for the initial Active Directory binding. If, however, we are there at the login window and we create an account via a third-party tool, a Jamf Pro policy, or a less third-party tool like Jamf Connect, or we log in with our managed administrator on a system which currently does not have a secure token, if that account is an admin account, we log in, that account gets a secure token. And obviously, if we have a secure token, we can then enable FileVault without any problem. The same will happen if you SSH or you authenticate in terminal or the system preferences with a local administrator on a system without a secure token. Catalina will give that account a secure token. If, however, we log in with a standard account on a tokenless system, we do not get a secure token. And we have a bigger problem than that, because a standard local account without a secure token on macOS Catalina cannot enable FileVault. A mobile standard account can, a local standard account cannot. So we will have to fix the secure token for that standard account. Which brings us to, first of all, Bootstrap. So Bootstrap, we discussed a little bit in terminology, was introduced to facilitate the generation of secure token for the managed administrator or mobile accounts. The requirements are that the Mac needs to be registered in Apple Business Manager or School Manager in order to enroll via automated MDM enrollment. User-initiated enrollment does not enable Bootstrap. So if we enroll via automated enrollment, we go through the setup assistant. We again have the choice to either create an account or not. If we do create an account in the system, in the setup assistant, Bootstrap will be escrowed and enabled if the MDM server you enroll into supports it. Obviously, with Jamf Pro, that is the case. If, however, we skip account creation, Just like Secure Token, Bootstrap is not automatically enabled. Yes, we can enable that manually via terminal. We're going to have a look at that later. But the good news is that even if Bootstrap is not enabled, but the MDM server supports it, if we log in with a Secure Token enabled account, and that can be any account, doesn't need to be the managed administrator, any Secure Token account will do, that will then automatically bootstrap, or macOS will at least try to escrow Bootstrap at that moment. If we do have Bootstrap enabled, either automatically, manually, or by logging in with a Secure Token holder, and we log in with a mobile account afterwards, like we said, that account did not have a Secure Token previously if Bootstrap is not enabled. But if Bootstrap is enabled, the Bootstrap token will generate a Secure Token for the mobile account. The same happens with the managed administrator. Again, not the Jamf management account if that's configured as a different account, but the managed administrator from the pre-stage will get a Secure Token. Again, you need to log in through the login window to leverage the Secure Token via Bootstrap. If we log in with any other account, and that is on macOS Catalina, that account will not get a Secure Token from Bootstrap. I know macOS Big Sur is around the corner. There might or will be some changes regarding that. And this is basically everything which is in this a little bit complex flowchart. But nevertheless, I would recommend to go through that flowchart and really familiarize yourself with how it works now on Catalina, as from 15.4, including .6, in order to be fully ready when the new macOS is released. And in that case, you can easily transition any changes that macOS Big Sur might or may bring. Next topic for this session is remotely enforcing FileVault. And this can be either done with a configuration profile, a Jamf Pro policy, or even Jamf Connect login. If we have a look at configuration profiles, High Sierra and later, we will typically require FileVault 2, choose our type of recovery key, and escrow the personal recovery key, if we're using that, into our MDM, which is then going to send the recovery key to the inventory of our device. If, however, you're still managing Macs pre-High Sierra, in that case, the escrow doesn't work, and we have to use the legacy FileVault recovery key redirection payload, which is then going to create a certificate to redirect the key into the inventory of the Mac in Jamf Pro. One thing, although there was an issue with that in the past, which is supposed to be fixed, I would still recommend, if you have pre and post High Sierra devices to manage, is to create 2 smart groups with 2 profiles, because I have seen the recovery key redirection being a breaker for the escrow if we mix things. So I still stick to 2 profiles, depending the situation. If we enable FileVault with a policy, the first thing we'll have to do is create a disk encryption in the Jamf Pro settings. And this is where we would then upload our institutional recovery key if we choose to use that. I prefer to use a personal recovery key. I also prefer the name personal instead of individual, especially if we use abbreviations. But if you use an institutional recovery key, you would make the keychain. We're going to have a look at the command later. And then upload the keychain either with or without the private key in Jamf Pro. The reason to upload it with a private key is for safekeeping. Whenever you need the private key to decrypt a computer where the user lost the password or forgot the password, then you know it's safely stored in Jamf Pro and you can download it in the settings. But you can also upload it without the private key, because the encryption will actually only use the public key anyway to encrypt the drives. As we're going to see later, if you use a policy, you can just upload it with a private key. If you use a profile, you will need to upload it without a private key, otherwise the profile will break. Once you have the disk encryption created in the Jamf Pro settings, you can then make your policy, choose the configuration or the disk encryption configuration that you created, and push that or scope that policy to the devices that needs to be FileVault encrypted. The last option to enable FileVault is Jamf Connect login. And I'm going to go very fast through this topic because I could do another session purely on Jamf Connect and FileVault. But what happens basically is that we add a few keys to the Jamf Connect logging plist, which is then going to trigger an FDE setup process when the user is created. There is, however, one feature that I want to highlight here, and that is the local administrator password solution. In that case, we would add the Labs user key to the Jamf Connect logging plist and choose an administrator which exists on the Mac. It can be any administrator that exists on the Mac. What's going to happen is that if Jamf Connect is creating the account or logging in with the account through the Jamf Connect logging window, it will then trigger the FDE setup workflow and enable FileVault by using this administrator that we defined in the plist. It will get a personal recovery key by enabling FileVault. It will then cycle its own password to that recovery key so that it has that new password in its memory to then give a secure token to the local account which is created by Jamf Connect. Because the cycle of the password, we need to be careful with passcode policies, which we push with a configuration profile, because we could break the cycle setting to the personal recovery key if that doesn't honor the requirements of our policy. And last thing to remember is that the Labs feature in Jamf Connect logging only works if Jamf Connect is creating a standard account. Because of the timing in which accounts are created, Jamf Connect cannot create an administrator account and then use another administrator account to manipulate secure tokens just by the order at which things are happening. So only for the creation of standard accounts. One final thing, if we use this feature on macOS Catalina, we need to push an additional profile to allow this process on Catalina. And I'm going to share a link to this profile, which you just upload into Jamf Pro and push to all your devices. But the profile is required for this feature to work. Next, we already talked a little bit about recovery keys, but just to summarize it, personal recovery key, like I said, a pseudo-random code. If you escrow or redirect the recovery key correctly into Jamf Pro, you will find it in the inventory. You will also be able to check if the key is still valid. An institutional recovery key, like I said, is a keychain, which we basically create with a security command. Security create FileVault master keychain and then the path where to store it. And then we need to store this keychain, including the private key, in a secure location. You can upload it in Jamf Pro for safekeeping or somewhere hide it in a forest behind a big tree. It doesn't matter as long as you know where it is whenever you need it to decrypt the drive. Like I said, if you upload it to Jamf Pro with a private key for safekeeping, you can use it in a policy. But if you want to use a profile with an institutional key, you will also have to upload it without the private key, or the encryption with an institutional key will break. This is how it looks. It's a basic keychain. If you would open it in the keychain access, public key represented by a certificate and a private key in that keychain, which you then export with or without the private key. And then, just like I mentioned, in the settings of Jamf Pro, that's where we would upload the institutional recovery key. Troubleshooting and fixes. We'll have to go quite quick through this final section of this session, but at the end of the session, there will be a link to a demo of in which I used some of the commands that I'm going to discuss, and I will share the link to the video at the end of this session. Whenever we have to troubleshoot FileVault, the first thing we always have to do is to check which local account has a secure token. And for that, we can use the discutil apfs command. I started using list crypto users, but if you have a look at the manual of discutil, it actually says that the correct command is list users. Both work with a / at the end for the root of the volume, and it will return you an overview of all the users or all the records, which has something to do with secure token. You will see the UUIDs of some local accounts, But you will also see a personal recovery user, which is basically the record behind the recovery key in macOS. It is not the recovery key on its own. It's just the placeholder where macOS stores that recovery key. And it will also show you the Bootstrap is enabled or not. The problem is, I don't know about you, but I don't memorize all the UUIDs of the accounts that I have to manage. So a better command to use is the FDA setup list extended, because it will basically give you the same information, a list of UUIDs, but as you can see on the right column, it also gives you the username in a readable text. Additional benefit of this command is that it may also list unknown users here in the right column, in case you have deleted accounts with some, so to say, bad scripting, or you used local snapshots while trying your deployments and you reverted to snapshots from before the setup assistant, etc. In that case, you can actually delete users, but the record of the secure token will survive on the system. The FDA setup command will list those as unknown users for you. The discutil command will not. So I prefer to use the FDA setup list in every test. If you want to check if a specific account is secure token enabled, we can use the sysadmin command, in which we have to pass the administrator credentials, username and password of an admin with a secure token, and then secure token status, the account which we want to check, and it will just tell you enabled or disabled for that specific account. Default enablement, like I said, expected behavior when you just executed a policy or installed a profile which enables FileVault, but that doesn't mean that things cannot go bad. In order to check if deferred enablement is active, we use FDA setup status, which is going to tell us if FileVault is on or off. But if the deferred enablement is active, it will also tell you deferred enablement appears to be active for that specific username. And that's expected. If you log in or log out, depending policy and profile settings, it will enable FileVault with this account. However, it can happen that you are testing, you are logging out, logging in, nothing happens. In that case, my first check would be secure token. If that account has a secure token, we're good. If it still doesn't work, my second guess would be that deferred enablement is one way or another corrupted. In that case, there is only one fix, and that is to unscope everything which does something with FileVault, put the Mac in an exclusion for your FileVault profile or policy, and disable FileVault. Even if the issue is that FileVault is not getting enabled, FDA setup disable, it will make sure that FileVault is off, but it will also cancel any active deferrals. But then the most important part is, after running that, you can run a FDA setup status to verify that the deferral is gone, but you need to reboot the Mac to really cancel the deferral. Reboot the Mac, FDA setup status again to be sure that the deferral is not there, and then you can try again with rescoping the profile or the policy. And everything should be fine if the account has a secure token. If we want to validate or check recovery keys, we have two commands to check personal and institutional recovery keys. FDA setup has personal recovery key, will give you true or false if that is the case, and has institutional recovery key, again, true or false, if the account has an institutional recovery key set or not. If you want to validate a very specific personal recovery key, for instance, the one that we have on file in Jamf Pro or wherever you stored it in the past, sudo FDA setup validate recovery, enter. It will prompt you to copy paste the recovery key, hit enter, and it will again give you true or false if that recovery key is valid. Renewing recovery key, we can do that manually. I will show that in the next slide. But important to know is that although there are some things in the Jamf Pro policy which broke since the introduction of secure token, the reissue personal recovery key feature in a policy still works. There are, however, some requirements, and that is that the Mac is running 10.14 or later. There is a recovery partition on the Mac. FileVault is obviously enabled. and then either one of the following conditions are met, or you have a valid personal recovery key in the inventory for this Mac, or if that is not the case because you encrypted the drives prior to enrolling into Jamf, you might not have, or you may not have the personal recovery key on file. In that case, the policy will also work if the management account has a secure token. So here it is not the managed administrator, according to Apple's philosophy with the Bootstrap and things like that. It is the management account, which is linked to that specific Mac in the inventory of Jamf Pro. If one of both is valid, the policy works fine. And it avoids any scripting needed to rotate recovery keys. I know there are a few very good scripts going around in the community, which still work. I will link them at the end of this session as well, but the policy works in that situation as well. If ever you want to do it manually, FDA setup change recovery -personal, and it will change the recovery key for you as well. You can script that, but you will need to include some expect statements in your script to authenticate with a secure token holder. If ever you do or you rotate a personal recovery key with a script or manually with this command, make sure that you have the escrow profile in place so that the new recovery key nicely escrows in the inventory in Jamf Pro. If you want to do it manually for a new institutional recovery key, there is a command for that as well, of course. FDA setup change recovery key -institutional, that's keychain, and then -certificate with the path where you have the certificate. So this means that you first need to install or deploy the certificate to the Mac, because you will need to provide the path to where macOS needs to read that public certificate to encrypt FileVault. Finally, Bootstrap. If ever you want to check if Bootstrap is enabled, sudo profile status --type Bootstrap token, and it will give you yes or no on two questions. First of all, it will tell you if the MDM server you are currently enrolled in is supporting Bootstrap. That should be okay for Jamf Pro. But it will also tell you if the Bootstrap token is actually escrowed to the server, which basically means if Bootstrap is active, yes or no. If you want to install or manually enable Bootstrap because you skipped user creation, for instance, and you did not log in with the secure token holder yet, sudo profiles install --type Bootstrap token. And if ever there is a scenario where you want to disable it, it's just the same command with remove. And then finally, scripting secure token, and that's maybe the most important command of all, the sysadmin command using an admin user account and password, which needs a secure token, or which has a secure token, to then pass a secure token to another user, which we put after the secure token on. We define username and password, and we user administrator to give a secure token to our other user. So as you see, you need the password of both the admin account, which has a token, as any other account that needs to receive a token. However, there is one exception, and that is if we are on a tokenless system, which is difficult with macOS Catalina in view of the flowchart and all the events that may trigger the creation of a secure token. But if you are on a secure token-less system on macOS Catalina, and you run this command with any admin and any user behind or after the secure token on, the command will give a secure token to both accounts. So quite handy to remember that one. Everything we discussed here, or everything I mentioned, is valid for macOS Catalina 10.15.4 and later. And I know we have macOS Big Sur around the corner, but in view of honoring non-disclosure of beta programs, although there are a lot of rumors and other channels where people discuss it, I kept it at macOS Catalina. But I'm confident that if you really understand how secure token, Bootstrap, FileVault, etc. works currently on macOS, even if there are changes in macOS Big Sur, it will be easily to import those in your current workflows and to tweak the understanding on how FileVault in general works. Like I promised, hereby a link to a website where I will share some other links with resources and things like that, but also a little video where I go through the majority of the commands I discussed and the workflows which you may encounter when you have to manage FileVault. That's it. Thank you very much for listening or watching this presentation. Enjoy this virtual JNUC 2020. Stay safe and see you next time. Bye-bye.